Some of you may know that there's this document in South Africa called the Freedom Charter. It's held up as the core values of our nation. It talks about the fact that this land belongs to all of the people that inhabit it, that the wealth will be shared amongst all of the people. It talks about the better nature of human beings, and it sets a goal for us that if we remain fixed on that, we would continue to move towards building an incredible society. So that was what we promised our people with liberation in 1994. But pretty soon after liberation, the government adopted a policy that was called GEAR, Growth, Employment and Redistribution. And really what GEAR did, it put the kind of structural adjustment programs that you see in the rest of Africa, people who've not honored their World Bank or IMF loans, and so the World Bank imposed these programs, but also in some of the countries in South America and many, many other areas of the globe. And these policies were clearly not appropriate for our country. Now, it's an academic discussion as to what would have been the appropriate policies. But the only thing we know more than anything else is that the consequence of that policies, like it has been in the rest of the world, has deepened the levels of inequality in our society. So even after the liberation of African people, black Africans in 1994, the levels of inequality became deeper. Unemployment rose from around 60% to close on to 40%. The divisions within many of our communities became more challenging. We now have many of the fancy drugs coming into our country at such a free level that it's tearing apart the communities. Poverty and many of the social marginalization that takes place in an environment where people are not clear about what their trajectory for life is has seen many young people resort to drugs, and it's torn apart their lives. Gangsters and abnormal behavior rules many of the communities. So there are incredible challenges that as a direct consequence sometimes of the policy decisions that we've taken. And for us it can't be more glaringly emphasized than the fact that the programs that we put in place to give expression to the Freedom Charter was called the Reconstruction and Development Program. But essentially the philosophical underpinnings of that is growth through redistribution. So you build a more equal society, and that leads itself to a sense of growth within the economy, because you're putting the economy on a different growth path. But what we have in our country now through the structural adjustment programs or GEAR is really a redistribution that follows growth. You would know the kind of trickle-down economics that's in many respects captured in what is broadly referred to as the Washington Consensus. But so those policy choices have led to incredible difficulties. You are in the Western Cape now, and the Western Cape used to have a thriving clothing industry that employed thousands of women, was often the only source of income in many homes on the Cape Flats, and Hester and will tell you more about what that had meant for our communities. Many of those clothing jobs are lost. They're lost because there wasn't any clear industrial plan that took us from an inwardly industrializing economy under apartheid to one that's open in the global economy, but one that had to make sure that it had clear industrial policy steps to defend the jobs, to defend the incomes, and to make sure that the basis of the South African society in respect of income is maintained as we integrate into the global economy. And so many of those choices had presented incredible difficulties, and what it did, it in part brought about a fissure within even the democratic movement, because the government, whilst not wanting to put in place measures that took care a lot more clearly of poor communities, had put in place measures that had taken care of what can only be defined as the black elite. And so many people who lived in exile and who heroes of the anti-apartheid struggle, they were taken up in many of the big white corporations, and they got 25% of the wealth of those companies, and they became multi-millionaires overnight. The point that I want to take from that is that the government regulated the enrichment of a black elite within the society. So they'd give billions of rands to wealthy black people, but they wouldn't give billions of rands to poor black people in the form of basic income grant or expanded social security, or making sure that we spend more money on education so that the resource base of poor and rich schools provided the same opportunity to all learners so that they could realize their potential. And this is the sad thing about it, because in the Freedom Charter we told young people that they would be the best that they can be, because the doors of learning and culture would be open to all of our people. We now know that the doors of learning and culture is not open to all. It's open to those who have money, because good education has really been commodified and only the wealthy can buy that. The township schools are in deep crisis. There's overcrowding, the lack of resources, and many, many other difficulties. But that inequality, I believe, has been a huge impediment to our ability of our society to respond to many of the challenges. Now, under the days of apartheid, we understood that the policies didn't work in our interest as black and poor communities. But we certainly expected under the new liberation government that those policies would work in our interest. So when it seemed not to do that, of course people are even more devastated. An injustice perpetrated by your own people and your own friends and your own comrades is doubly as painful as that of people who don't appreciate or respect your humanity. And that in part had led to many of the difficulties within the liberation movement in South Africa. But before I talk about that, I think it is important to say, though, that when we have any discussion in our country, we always look about the work that's undone, the things that has to be done, the shortcomings that we've not been able to respond to adequately. And that's important because that shows us the way forward. But it would be amiss if we didn't take a moment to say that we've also achieved an incredible amount in our country. You know, the end of apartheid was without doubt an incredible victory for our people. It set the foundation to be able to build a better life for all of our people. And it's made sure that the role and the location of women in our society has been greatly enhanced. Labor laws has shown that labor rights is a key human right in our country. And the legislation that goes to addressing the problems of children and other marginalized sectors has really been enshrined in the institutional frameworks. The difficulty that sometimes comes up is that we've demonstrated this great intent to our people. So we've put in place the laws and the frameworks and the institutions to be able to do that. But if you don't have the wealth that responds to you being able to implementing that program, you're not really going to be able to respond to people. And this is where, for us, I think there's a key lesson that has to be taken account of, even in other countries and as they struggle. It is impossible to separate the notions of political freedom from economic freedom, political transformation from economic transformation, and then social transformation. Because often you bring about political transformation, and so everybody has the vote, they have the franchise, but you don't transform the economy. You leave the economy in old hands, and the state doesn't really have the wealth to address the legacy caused in our instances by apartheid. And so you're unable to address those social factors. So you've got to make sure that you deal with those three areas of transformation in society in an interrelated way. There was a big constitutional case in our country a few years back where the Constitutional Court ruled that there's a right for people to have homes. But it qualified that right by saying if the state has the resources. Now the state didn't have the resources in that instance to make sure that that right could have been enforced in respect of the woman and the children who needed a home. But the state didn't have the resources because under the policy of GEAR, the government gave back nearly 120 billion rand a year. So in tax cuts, the new policy that was put in place in 1996 meant there were tax cuts for the wealthy, and that meant 120 billion rand that should have been in the state coffers to address issues like housing and education went back into the pockets of the wealthy. And the wealthy bought private education and private healthcare and their own housing facilities and so on. So the point then is that we've got to make sure that we do indeed advance this notion of prosperity for all, but that the state has the ability to do that. Because in anything now, in the era of the global financial crisis, we know that there's got to be a different set of rules. America's probably been the one example again where your president was questioning some of the salary packages of some of the MDs, whose companies were going bankrupt through their mismanagement, but they were still hanging on to their perks, and yet coming to government and saying you must give us public dollars to bail out our companies. Now that is an indication of how there's some lack of morality in many of the boards and many of the company directors, and that there's an opportunity now, even in this crisis, with all of its difficulties, to define new roles, to build a new model of a global economy that responds to the things that will make us be proud to be human beings again. And so that's the kind of message that we hope will have resonance across the world, led by your president to a large extent, but in different ways echoed by other presidents. Many Latin American presidents like Lula and others have been making the same noise, and it's starting to come together from different perspectives, but starting to shape a world that puts people's interests and needs before profits, that understands profits as an important role to play, but it cannot be the only deciding factor.